The US government has recently announced a variety of sanctions against certain Russian oligarchs, Russian entities, and regions of the Ukraine. And there's a number of ways in which this can impact cryptocurrency and blockchain companies, even those that are not doing business in the United States. So today I'm going to discuss the recent sanctions programs, how they apply to crypto companies, and what crypto companies should do now to ensure that they don't violate the sanctions that the US government has recently imposed. US sanctions programs are managed by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control. And there are now dozens of different sanctions programs that sanction various sanction targets, including persons, entities, and even geographic regions. Generally, the sanctions prohibit US persons from engaging in transactions with any of those sanction targets. They also prohibit US persons from facilitating transactions by non-US persons with any of those sanction targets. And it's important to keep in mind that US persons can include companies that are based outside of the United States, but have a presence here in the United States. It also can include the employees of those companies. So if you have an employee that is a US citizen or even a green card holder, the prohibition on engaging in transactions with sanction targets can apply to those US persons. Over the past several years, OFAC has designated a number of different businesses that do business using cryptocurrency as sanctioned entities. That includes a Russia-based cryptocurrency exchange, as well as a cybercriminal organization that is also based in Russia that goes by the name Evil Corp. But the most common way in which cryptocurrency companies can run afoul of the sanctions programs that OFAC runs is by entering into a transaction with a sanctioned entity, or by facilitating a transaction, often by one of the cryptocurrency company's customers, with a sanctioned entity. And what makes the sanctions regime particularly scary for cryptocurrency companies is two things. First, many of the transactions that are engaged in using cryptocurrency are anonymous. And even if they're not anonymous, it can be very difficult to do due diligence on the nature of the entity that engaged in the cryptocurrency transaction. And the second thing is strict liability. So OFAC has come out and announced that they are going to impose sanctions on companies that violate sanctions programs based on a strict liability basis. And what that means is that if you're a cryptocurrency company and you engage in a transaction with a sanctioned entity and you're a US person, that you can be fined for violating the sanctions regime, even if you didn't even know that the entity with which you were engaging in a transaction was a sanctioned entity. There are a number of things that cryptocurrency companies can do to minimize the risk of inadvertently violating the US sanctions regime. The first is to look out for red flags. Fortunately, OFAC has identified a number of red flags that can indicate that a transaction might violate a US sanctions program. These include when a request for a transaction comes from an IP address that is in Russia or Belarus or any geographic region that has been specifically sanctioned by OFAC. It also includes when a transaction involves a cryptocurrency address that has been added to the SDN, or Specially Designated Nationals list, that OFAC publishes. Finally, it includes any transaction that comes into an account but from an exchange that is located in a geographic region that is known as high risk because of having anti-money laundering deficiencies. Finally, it's important to have a compliance program. And a compliance program will include things like transaction monitoring, know your customer policies, and blocking, because it's important to not just keep an eye on transactions so that you identify transactions that have already occurred that violate a sanctions policy or a sanctions program. It's also important to block those transactions from actually occurring. But there's a lot of complexity associated with sanctions laws. And in fact, even people that are expert in the sanctions regime can have reasonable disagreements about when a financial transaction or a transaction that involves a crypto asset of some sort violates a US sanctions program. But there's some good news. I'm a lawyer. So if you do have any questions about how the US sanctions regime applies to cryptocurrency transactions, give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you.